Welcome to Utah Lake Explore More, the official podcast of Utah Lake Authority. I'm Sam.
And I'm Courtney.
And in this podcast, we'll explore one of Utah's most important natural resources, Utah Lake. We'll talk with recreation experts, community leaders, conservation professionals, and people who know the lake best.
Have you ever been to Utah Lake and noticed some sort of weird green algae-looking splotches on the surface?
I have many times, unfortunately.
Yes. It's classic.
Yeah.
You probably wondered what those are and what causes them. So in today's episode, we are going to dive into what algae blooms are and why they occur.
I appreciate that hook. It's a good starter and a good question for people because everybody asks about algae blooms, but there's so little information about algae blooms, right?
Yeah.
It's something in the decade I've worked here, people constantly have bad information about. So that's our first topic today we're going to talk about is what are HABs, right? You may hear that abbreviation, HABs. It stands for harmful algal blooms or algae blooms, depending on the person. I think the algal is more like the scientific community, the technical term.
Yeah.
But HABs, right? And in our office, we like to use the phrase a lot, HABs happen. I know we're going to talk about that a lot today too, to be aware of. But to start with, HABs season, generally speaking, is summertime, right? June, July through September. Occasionally we see some a little bit earlier, a little bit later, but in that warm time of year in Utah is when we see it the most, right?
This year, actually, I think we're seeing some blooms early. Not in Utah Lake. Utah Lake has none yet, but in some other water bodies in Utah, they're already starting.
I think my wife would use the phrase, she's waiting for the other shoe to drop. I hear about these other blooms at other water bodies. I'm like, okay, when's Utah Lake going to be in the news?
It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. It's funny, too, that people think that it's associated with one water body, right? They don't realize that it's in so many places.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that it's also caused exclusively by human activity, right? I often hear people vilifying the wastewater treatment plants, for instance, thinking, oh, it's horrible that they put their water into the lake. It's what causes the blooms. Those guys are one of the heroes, right? They're treating our raw sewage, which is what used to go into Utah Lake and other water bodies, to try and reduce those nutrients, right? But they are naturally occurring. They happen all across, harmful algae blooms that occur all across the world, all across the state, all across the U.S. In Utah alone, my last count was, I think it's either 40 or mid 40s of water bodies, and by that lakes, reservoirs, even the Virgin River, which people think of as this awesome river that runs through Zion National Park, they all get them at some point, right? So I think that's a common misconception is that people think blooms are only at one location. They also think that it means the water is always polluted or contaminated, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think it is just like sewage or something, but all it really is excessive amounts of nutrients in the water, like phosphorus, nitrogen. And these are things that we use for fertilizer.
Totally.
These are things that we see
naturally
every day.
occurs,
Yeah,
the bacteria
exactly.
that's there, right?
Yeah. So Utah Lake is especially susceptible to HABs. It's super shallow and it's very nutrient rich. So we've talked a lot about the sediment at the bottom of the lake. That sediment is full of nutrients. And also not all of the algae that we see at the lake is actually harmful.
That's a good point. A lot of people confuse that.
Yeah, and it's really hard to tell the difference. You really need a professional, a scientist, to actually tell you the difference between a harmful versus a not harmful bloom.
But we'll give you some tips a little bit later, okay? We'll give you a few.
Yes, don't worry. But yeah, these blooms are caused by something called cyanobacteria. This is commonly referred to as blue-green algae, and this is what makes the blooms toxic. And remember what I said about those excessive nutrients? So the name for that is eutrophication. So when those nutrients start becoming an algae bloom, that's when it turns into eutrophication. And eutrophication and sunlight, or just heat in general, are what fuel the growth of those cyanobacteria. And then those toxins are produced, and those can be fatal to dogs or make humans really sick. And algae, I feel like all of these facts are like a little bit scary.
Sure.
But algae is something that's actually really important for the ecosystem. Obviously, we get these blooms and they can become really big and really scary, but naturally, algae it's a primary food source, you know? It's the base of the food chain for a lot of ecosystems, including Utah Lake. So they are important.
That's why I feel like the differentiation between HABs and algae blooms,
Exactly.
or even bloom really, is people realize, sure, algae is there. It's when things get out of whack that it's a problem, right?
Yeah.
We get too much nutrients or too much heat, then suddenly you get this huge bloom, and that's where there's a problem, right?
Exactly, yeah. So when these blooms become a HAB, or harmful algae bloom, it can become something that's detrimental to the environment. So underneath of an algae bloom is where a lot of the damage happens. So how I like to teach this is picture a giant umbrella.
Okay.
So if the sun was completely blocked by this giant umbrella, what would happen to all of our crops?
They'd all die because they're not getting any sunlight.
Yeah, and as a result, we'd have no food, right? So there'd be no photosynthesis, no crops, no food. So it'd cause this cascading effect. And this is the same thing that happens beneath an algae bloom. The algae acts as sort of a huge umbrella on the surface of the water, blocking all the sunlight from reaching those aquatic plants underneath. And it can cause those plants to die because they can't photosynthesize. And without those underwater plants, there is a shortage of oxygen in the water, and that can cause the fish or just the other plants to die.
I know there was one on the Jordan River last year, if I remember correctly, and I think the Virgin River may have had one the last year or two too, where a fish die-off will happen enough oxygen.
Yeah, because that algae can just get so thick.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's crazy too, because we're not here to try and say that algae blooms aren't important, right? Or that we don't need to learn about them, but we also don't want people to be scared of them, right?
Exactly.
I think that's where a lot of the challenges come in algae blooms, is that they are seen as this boogeyman, if you will, of the natural world.
Yeah.
And in all reality, it doesn't have to be scary, right? In our office, we often compare for people that harmful algae bloom season is like flash flood season or avalanche season, right? I mentioned Zion National Park in the Virgin River. If anybody's have you hiked the subway before?
No.
Okay, you should.
Okay.
It's totally worth it. I did it twice as a teenager with Boy Scouts. Absolutely gorgeous. You don't hike the subway during flash flood season, right? But that doesn't make the subway unsafe year round, and it doesn't mean that the subway is not beautiful or a great opportunity. But during that season, you shouldn't do it, right? Or any of the canyons in southern Utah. Same thing with avalanche season. We're known for our snow in Utah, but there is a time of year and conditions that occur that mean it's not safe, you shouldn't go do it. That's the way we try and encourage people to think about harmful algae bloom season, right? Is that they have a chance to go to the lake when it's not happening. When it is happening, what should they watch for, right? But some other reassurance, sickness is very rare. It doesn't happen very often that humans get sick. It also often does not affect all of Utah Lake. That's actually one benefit to Utah Lake being as large as it is, that other water bodies that are smaller, if they get an algae bloom, it might affect the entire lake right away. In Utah Lake, it's 97,000 acres of surface area when it's full. We could have one marina with an algae bloom or one bay with an algae bloom. So it's important people check advisories and realize where do they apply, right?
Yeah.
I think that's critical.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest misconception is if you see algae, it's like, okay, can't go in the water at all. But it's more like, don't swim in the algae.
Oh yeah,
you know?
Don't go there then.
Yes, yeah.
And also that it doesn't mean there's something wrong always, right?
Just go to a different location, find somewhere that doesn't have algae and you're good to go.
Yep, and also you can learn the signs, right? That's something important we're gonna talk about in just a minute, is that you can learn how to identify and recognize harmful algal blooms too. Totally. They're a natural thing, we gotta prepare for them, do the best we can. It's just like checking a weather forecast, right? You wanna make sure you know the conditions before you head out there. And I don't know if we've mentioned it yet, I'm sure we'll talk about it more later, but there's a great website, habs.utah.gov. So again, that's that same abbreviation, habs.utah.gov. We'll put a link on here for you guys. But that is the statewide website for all harmful algae bloom information. So you can see a map of which water bodies, you can see pictures to recognize them. It's a great tool for the public.
Yeah.
So next, as I said a second ago, we got to transition to talking to people about how they can recognize them, right? You're probably listening to this and you're like, okay, that all sounds cool. What am I looking for? What are we trying to aim for?
What is a HAB?
Yeah. Well, I think that people think it's something where like, oh, you have to be able to sample the water and test. No, you can use some pretty good rules of thumb to watch for algae blooms. In fact, I went on habs.utah.gov and I made a list of all of the terms they use to describe all of the different variations of bacteria that you should, or excuse me, harmful algae and bacteria you should watch for. And I'm sure we can throw up some images for you guys to see what they look like too. But they start with things like pea soup. If you've ever had pea soup before, if you look like you're seeing pea soup in the water, that's probably a harmful algae bloom. That's one type. Spilled paint. Everybody can think about what spilled paint looks like, right? That's a very obvious thing. Green scum, green mats, bright green, globules. That's my favorite one. That's just a fun word to say, globules.
Like chunks
just chunks of mat and stuff in the water that are suspended in there. Blue-green residue. This is one you'll see, I feel like, a lot on the shoreline where the coloring looks like streaks, like almost like paint that didn't quite get mixed.
Yeah.
And it's got that change in coloration, right?
Yeah, like when there's an oil spill and there's like that tint to it.
Yeah, totally. And then the last two, grass clippings. This one's an easy one because everybody knows what grass clippings look like. That's pretty self-explanatory. You'll see those in the water column more. And then benthic mats. This is like globules, but like even bigger. Like it's a really big floating mass. So those are some of the easy images that people can think about in recognizing. And you can go on to habs.utah.gov. They have a whole section of what is a harmful algae bloom, what is a HAB, that you can see what those images look like. And you can start to recognize when you go out to the water and see if you see it. When you see that, go to a different area. right? Or if you've checked the advisory ahead of time, you'll know whether that algae bloom applies to the whole lake or to just one section.
Yeah. And from what I've heard, that website, habs.utah.gov, it's updated like all the time. They're going out there to check all
They're
the
usually
bodies
out
of
weekly,
water.
if I remember correctly, and getting
Yeah,
up to date.
that's what I was going to say. I think it's about weekly. So it's super up to date. So it's a good resource.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to how HABs happen. How do they occur?
Oh, true, because it's not just us, right? We said that earlier, but we didn't tell everybody what else causes them.
Yeah, so it's not just humans. Humans, like we said, they can definitely worsen the effects, but HABs are natural. So one of the main sources of all of those nutrients that fuel HABs is runoff. So runoff is water from rain, sprinklers, snowmelt, anything that flows across land into a storm drain or a stream, and it'll all eventually end up in a lake.
Sure.
So these excessive nutrients, they come from a lot of different places. Sometimes it's from a single super easy to identify source. That's called a point source. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out where that pollution came from.
Sure, yeah.
And that is what we call a non-point source. So those point sources that it's runoff from a single identifiable source, that can be something like a wastewater discharge pipe, like straight from a treatment plant. We know exactly where that water is coming from. You could trace it back to the source. Or like a fuel leak from a boat. You can trace those things. When it comes to a non-point source, that's going to be runoff that can't be traced back to a single source. So something like from agriculture. Agricultural land takes up so much of the state, and so it's really hard to trace all of that back. Oil from roads. It can be hard to figure out what car did that oil come from.
Sure, yeah.
You never know. Pet waste, lawn fertilizer, things like this that are just harder to bring back to the exact source of that pollution.
I think you're hitting on a really important point here that wasn't in our notes that I want to stress in this, which is I think when we say runoff, a lot of people, including myself at the start of this episode, think, oh, you're talking about the stuff that comes down from the mountains through the creeks and the rivers, right? But runoff is describing a resulting entrance to the lake from some other kind of activity.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
And I think you gave some great examples of what a point source versus a non-point source. And there's even some others that make it really hard to quantify. Like I know, again, I mentioned people like to vilify the stormwater treatment plants. Those are a point source, right? Like you said, we know that. They are a large contributor, right? But we also have things like the rivers and streams, runoff from the roads, like you mentioned. There's even one that I want to mention because it's so fun to say, actually, is atmospheric deposition. This is a fancy big word for saying storms blow in dust and dirt, right? That's another factor. So there's tons of sources of these nutrients, and it's hard to control.
Totally.
It's part of why the lake has become the way it is. People think it was just humans dumping stuff into the lake, whether it was raw sewage, like we mentioned, or something else, but there's tons of contributing factors.
Yep. And that's the thing is water will find its way back to the lake.
Oh,
and
yeah.
What is that water coming in contact with before it reaches the lake?
Totally.
So most of the nutrient pollution in Utah Lake comes from those non-point sources. So it's hard to identify a lot of the sources of pollution. And that just adds another layer of difficulty to monitoring and managing the lake. But it really all comes back to that eutrophication. Water runoff is contributing to excessive nutrients in Utah Lake, and that is what's triggering these massive algae blooms.
Sure, it's a good point.
Yeah.
And I know we can't hit on everything today because harmful algae blooms are such a complex topic, right? Like we talked some about the fact of what things people can identify. We talked about some of the sources of contribution, but there's also other complexities, right? A lot of people say, oh, you're not doing anything for harmful algae bloom to try and fix it.
Yeah.
Sure, there are some treatments that we're not pursuing, but one big one is carp removal. So I know we talked in another episode about carp removal. That is actually one of the main things we're doing right now that helps with algae blooms.
Totally.
Right? There's been research that shows, core sampling that was done, that after carp were introduced, beforehand, the lake was predominantly macrophyte dominated, a lot of underwater vegetation. After carp introduction, there is this drastic shift over to eutrophication, right? An algae bloom or an algae dominant ecosystem. So carp are a part of that. Harmful algae bloom management is not a simple topic, right? There's a lot of levers that could be pulled, but they might have other effects we have to be aware of.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we focus on, we are doing research, we're testing out technologies, we're getting rid of carp, which is helping with algae blooms, but we want people who are listening to learn algae blooms are, I don't want to say they're here to stay because maybe someday we will be successful and get rid of them, but for now, they're here to stay.
Yeah.
We have to know about them, we have to know when they occur, we have to know how to recognize them so that we can still recreate safely, just like people have to learn about avalanches or flash floods and make safe decisions. So for a recap on what we talked about, I know I've hit on a lot of it, but basically HABs are a normally occurring thing, right? Getting algae blooms in nature is just like saying bugs are a normally occurring thing. Sure, we don't like them, but they are there. They're a part of it, right? They can occur across the entire lake, but more often it's usually just a small section of Utah Lake. So check habs.utah.gov to know where it applies. If you see a bloom, doesn't necessarily mean you have to leave. You could find a different location. You also could change your activity. That's one thing too that we'll be doing a future episode, interviewing anglers and others, is that there are different recreation types you can still do at Utah Lake even during an algae bloom. Be safe. Fishing is one of them. The advice on fishing is that if there is a warning advisory, you should just clean it if you're going to eat it. You don't even have to eat it. So if not, there's no change in your activity. You can still fish at the lake.
True.
So I think it's important people learn what can they do, right? It's kind of the last thing I want to share here, which is be mindful of how you are affecting water runoff near you as one clear call to action. If you have a dog, clean up its poop, right? Don't over-fertilize your yard. If you're lucky enough to have a single-family home, don't put stuff down your storm drain, right? I know that's a big one on the Jordan River we hear about a lot. Leaves and other garbage, those get down to the lake, those pollute and add to it. So those are easy things people can do to help themselves. Another thing you can do is visit habs.utah.gov and learn how to recognize harmful algae blooms and also how to help us overcome the narrative that is out there. Yeah. That people think it's only a Utah Lake thing, or they think that an algae bloom occurring at a lake means the lake is never safe to be in, right? Nobody would ever go to Zion National Park because the Virgin River has algae blooms almost every year. When the bloom is done, totally safe to go back there again.
Yeah. Yeah. So remember, HABs happen.
HABs
They're
happen.
natural. It's okay. You can find another place to recreate. It's not going to ruin your fun. But yeah. So thanks for joining us for this episode of Utah Lake Explore More. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Utah Lake and subscribe to our YouTube. And until next time, get outside, explore more, and we'll see you at the lake.